should work. Perfect, got it. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Naomi Nishi. I'll just give you a quick intro to who I am, and then we'll jump right into the topic at hand. So I am a scholar practitioner based at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the Anschutz Medical Campus here at CU Denver. And at Anschutz, I am the Associate Director of Educational Outreach. So that means that I'm working with faculty both on the medical campus and the Denver campus to hone their grants and work on their grant development process to make them more competitive for grant proposals. And my PhD is in education. My research focuses on racial equity within higher ed. So that is a little bit about me. And I'm so thankful to be invited to talk with the GMaP folks again, especially since some of our Anschutz Medical Campus faculty are a part of GMaP. So welcome to all of you if you're here. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, I don't think I can share my screen. Let's see if I can do it. Nope, not yet. Maria, I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But they reset our computers and it reset all of my. It's not helpful that I just find these things out now. All right, yeah. So is it not working?
Let me try again.
No.
Okay, now I can. We're good. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. All right. So let's see. So can folks see the National Institutes of Health review process slides? Okay, in Prezi? Perfect. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the NIH review process. I feel like this is a very important process to talk about that folks don't necessarily think about. Oftentimes when you develop your NIH proposal, you work with your Office of Grants and Contracts and you submit it, and then it's gone into the abyss until you hear back on whether it was funded or not and get your summary statement and your scores. So we want to sort of demystify that abyss today, just because it helps us to better hone our grant proposals when we know how they'll be used. I think we've talked about this in the last couple of presentations, but it's so important not only to think about the audience for your proposal, but to also think about how the document itself will be used. I like to say it's not read in the same way that somebody would read a novel. Nobody's snuggled up by the fire reading your grant proposal from start to finish. They're flipping through it. They're all over the place. They're looking for what they need to make sense of it and then to discuss it intelligently during the review process. So knowing how these documents get used and how they get assessed is really vital to success, particularly in the NIH, and I would argue for any agency. So as I've done with our past presentations, I do want to start with checking in with all of you to see what questions you might have. So if you could either unmute yourself and just ask a question, or if you'd prefer, you can type in the chat box. But what questions are you coming with today, things you're wondering about the NIH review process that I can make sure, or try my best to make sure we cover all of those questions. So I'll give you just a second to think about that and to share any questions you're coming in with.
Hi.
Hi.
I will start with a question. So one of the things that I'm sort of hoping to get out of today is thinking about, I'm planning to apply to NCI and how to, I don't want to use the word sell, but how to convince reviewers that disparities are worthwhile and are like within the NCI domain rather than like, minority health and health disparities. I think there are some review sections that are a little bit more bought in to disparities research, and how do you sort of sell your grant to people who may not like inherently buy into disparities research as its own like super important question. So that's my long-winded one.
Gotcha. Nope, that is a good one. And I see a couple are coming in on the group chat. So what are common pitfalls and ways researchers can avoid them? Where is your father? What? Where are we gonna go? Go find Dad. I am giving a presentation. Apologies. I've locked my children out, but they're crawling in the window. All right, back to. All right, what are common pitfalls and ways researchers can avoid them during the grant application process? Okay, yep, those are good. And then what specific items do the reviewers look for in the mentor and career plan? Ooh, this is also a good one. And I'll just make a quick note on that last one related to mentor and career plan. We are planning to do another webinar specifically on NIHK awards on September 9th at 1 o'clock Mountain Time. So we will get a little more into that mentor and career plan during that presentation too. So pitfalls, talking about convincing folks of disparities, particularly within the NCI. We will work that into our conversation. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is Jean McDougall from the University of New Mexico. And I think one of the things I have always struggled and seems like a black box is how to communicate with program officers and pick a review panel. And it seems like the secret to doing well, everybody says, is having people who are advocating for you and like your proposal, but actually reaching out and communicating, and how often, successful grantees are talking to their program officer, when you should be doing that kind of thing. I feel like I send my specific aims and then I'm like nervous to contact them again for a while. But I don't totally understand what that relationship is supposed to look like and how to really maximize it. So that would be helpful.
Yeah, great question. All right, and another thing has come in. It sounds like somebody's, okay, there we go. All right, along with Jenny's question about disparities, I got feedback on my first LRP application, which will be similar to my K proposal, that I needed more justification for wanting to work with smaller Native communities. How do I, like Jenny, make the argument for work that seems obviously important? I'll also submit to NCI. Okay. All right, we will talk about those things too. All right, now, as we move on, I want to invite you to continue unmuting yourself, particularly if I'm trying to address a question that came up and I didn't quite get it, or you want to have more conversation about it, please jump back in so we can have a conversation. Also, I like to acknowledge all of the experience that you all have in our virtual room together. So also do not hesitate if you have your own comments, suggestions, advice for your colleagues as well. So with that said, let's move on. Here. All right. So what I want to start by doing is to walk you through where your application goes once it's received by the NIH. So once you or your grant administrator hits submit, what is the process? Where is it going through? Who's making what decisions on your proposal? And the first place that it is sent is the Center for Scientific Review, Receipt and Referral. So your application goes to the CSR. At this point, you have folks in the CSR not reviewing your application, but going through and making sure that it is complete and that you've complied with all the rules. I will take a little break to share this statistic that only 40% of applications that are submitted to agencies overall are actually reviewed. And that's because many are rejected upon reception because the author, the PI, did one of two things. They either didn't follow the rules or their application was not a good fit for the agency and program to which they complied. So if you think about the majority of applications not even making it into the review process, it behooves you to think very carefully and to be very careful to make sure that both your application is a good fit, which is a place that you can use those conversations with program officers. I'll also mention right here, along the lines of working with program officers, we last month did our presentation specifically on working with program officers, and that was recorded. So if you want to get a little more into the nitty-gritty on working with program officers, please do check that one out to see when exactly you should be working with program officers. Although we will, again, touch on it here too as we're working through this process, particularly when we're talking about resubmissions. So after the CSR has done all of their work checking that your application is complete, that you've complied, that it is ready for review, then you have, then they assign the applications to an institute and to a study section. So if you're not overly familiar with how things work within the NIH, study sections will go across institutes. So it's not like one institute runs all its own study sections. They're separate entities overlapping. The study sections are more topic specific. And so you can have a study section reviewing applications that will ultimately go to different institutes for funding after the review process is over. So along those lines, whoops, I'll point this out in just a second, but you have the opportunity to recommend which study section and which institute your application goes to. And usually that is followed by the CSR professionals who send on your applications. The only times that those are not followed is if the CSR officer thinks that something else, a different study section would be a better fit, or if the scientific review officer who's running the study section does not think your proposal is a good fit for their study section, that SRO may send your application to a different study section. But generally, they honor the study section and institute that you are asking to be reviewed for. So how do you pick a study section? Now, certainly, I will say that the first and foremost way of selecting a study section is working with your mentor, your advisors, to find out where they're submitting and to get their advice on where you should be submitting. This is because your mentors generally have had experience, whether they've served on a study section before, they've had certain success, they've been working with the program officers to be submitting their work to the best study sections for their work, and they will have great insight into where you should be submitting as well. Having said that, there are other tools that you can use to pick the best study section. Now, here you see a screenshot of NIH Reporter. So it's real easy to find. If you go to the NIH website and look under research, you'll find their NIH Reporter tool. you can do several things with this tool. You can look at what grant applications have been submitted and awarded. This is a good idea to do a search to see what things in your area have been funded recently, just to see where the NIH or where a particular institute is putting their money right now, but also to make sure that your research project isn't heavily overlapping with a project that the NIH or the institute you're applying to has already funded. But what I want to show you here is this matchmaker tool. Now this tool is pretty handy. I recommend you do it even if you're pretty clear on which study section and institute you're applying to. What you do is you take the abstract for your research project and you enter the text in this little window that you see right here. The text is a little small, but it says enter your text, and then there's a submit and a clear button at the bottom. So if you enter your abstract for your project into the matchmaker tool, it produces a report that shows you the rates of success that similar projects to yours have had in the different institutes and the different study sections. So take a look at that, put your abstract into the matchmaker tool and see what they said. So the example here that I had used shows that this person, knowing nothing else, will probably have the best luck at NIA or maybe NINDS, but NIA is by far funding projects like this PI's more than the others. And then over on the study section side, we can see in the green that the CDIN study section and the ZAG, I don't know if that's one or an I don't know what those stand for. Those are probably the best chances that this PI has, knowing nothing else. So maybe this PI has a mentor who says, yeah, it says that, but I've always had success with this similar research in this institute in this study section. And I would always defer to your mentor before I used this matchmaker tool. But it can give you some insight into where different projects are being funded. And along with that, you can see at the bottom here, it's listing the different types of projects that this tool has decided are similar to your project. So you can even then go and see what's been funded recently that aligns with the kind of work that you want to do. So I'll pause here to see if there's questions or comments about these tools. Okay. So once you've kind of assessed what the best study section is and the best institute is, you of course want to make sure that you're choosing the right mechanism through the NIH. There are lots of R's and K's and all sorts of different types of mechanisms at the NIH that you can choose from. Sometimes it's very obvious what type of grant you're going to go for. Sometimes it's less obvious and you could go one way or the other. The important point is you want to make sure that there is a funding announcement in the institute that you're looking at. The institutes are sort of notorious for changing whether they participate in different mechanisms as they go. Every so often an institute will decide like, oh, we're gonna make our own form of this K grant instead of using the one that everybody else is using. I don't know why they do that. Sometimes it feels like it's just to make things a little more difficult. But make sure you find the parent announcement for the mechanism that you decide is right for you. So having said all that, back to receipt by CSR of your proposal. So in addition to submitting your proposal, you'll fill out this PHS assignment request form. And this is the place where you're going to request the institute that you want your proposal to be considered. You will also request the study section that you think your proposal should be reviewed in. You can identify inappropriate reviewers for any reason. If there are reviewers that it would not be appropriate for them to review your proposal, you can list those folks. And then also you can identify the necessary expertise that you think the reviewers need to have to adequately review your proposal. And this assignment request form will help the SRO to make decisions about your proposal and the review, and to decide if you're right, this is the right study section for you, or if they need to gain additional reviewers with different expertise to adequately review your proposal. This is where you give them your recommendations. So once we're in the CSR and it has been passed on, it is now in the domain of the study section. So as we talked a little bit about last time, there are both program officers and there are scientific review officers at the NIH. And these are both, for all intents and purposes, program officers, but the NIH has divided the responsibilities that most agencies just have one type of program officer to cover. So the SRO is, for all intents and purposes, running the study section. Usually you will not be talking to an SRO. So getting back to that question about when to work with program officers, when you are developing your grant proposal and want to talk to somebody about if it's going to be a good fit for a particular institute, for a particular program, then you're going to be wanting to call the program directors at the institute or emailing them to set up a phone call and get their feedback on if you're headed in the right direction. So I do recommend that you have those conversations with the PO early on, but this is a different person than the SRO. There are some times that talking to an SRO will make sense, but I recommend that usually you want to wait for a PO to say, oh, you're going to need to contact the SRO to ask them that question. I would usually work through the PO and get referred to the SRO before I call them, because the SRO's job is less to interact with PIs, if at all. It's more to run an objective study section. So once the SRO has received all of the proposals that are going to be reviewed in their next study section meeting, they will assign your proposal to 3 to 4 reviewers. So you will have a primary assigned, a secondary, and then a tertiary and discussants after that, primary and secondary. Those folks are responsible for reviewing your proposal given the criteria that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and scoring it. And we'll talk also about scoring. Scores are 1 through 9, with 1 being the best. So the reviewers that are assigned your proposal will give preliminary scores for all of the criterion, and they will also write preliminary critiques for each of the criteria and write a summary of what they thought of your proposal overall. And these are eventually available to you after some editing by the SRO through ERA Commons. And then all of the reviewers who are assigned your proposal will also share their comments with each other. And this is all before the study section meeting happens. This is the prep work. So I think I showed this picture maybe last time or maybe a couple times ago, but this is an old picture. We could tell it's old because these people are not sitting 6 feet apart and they're not wearing masks. But before the pandemic, When study sections happened in person, this is what it looked like. So you had around, I think there are about 30 people in this study section, 30 reviewers. You have a chair who is running the meeting. The chair is a different person than the SRO, but the SRO is always present, making sure that the study section is running efficiently and effectively. So we will go into, and I talked a little bit about this. So the SROs already, they're deciding on your applications. They also are looking for conflict of interest. If there are any reviewers who really cannot be reviewing your grant proposal, they will be having them sit it out. They're also recruiting reviewers for additional expertise that they might need, and they're making sure that the study section is working effectively. They will also prepare summary statements for those proposals that are reviewed in a study section, if your proposal is discussed in study section. And although the SRO is the one who prepares the summary statement, it will still be the program officer at the institute that you'll want to talk to after you get feedback on your proposal if you're not funded that time. Oftentimes the program officer will be in the room, or they will have had conversations with the SRO to know what happened, and they will be able to give you a little additional insight into the review of your proposal and hopefully offer you ideas on how to best revise and resubmit your proposal. So after your reviewers who are assigned to your proposal make their initial scores and critiques of your proposal, then the SRO sort of chops the number of proposals in half, and the half with the best scores, the lowest scores, are discussed in the study section meeting. So when you get an ND or a not discussed as a score on a proposal, along with the individual scores from those initial reviewers, that's what that means. It means that you didn't make it into the top half of the proposals reviewed at that meeting. And so yours was triaged and was not discussed. So the half that are discussed during the review meeting, this is sort of how it goes. You have your primary, who is the main person speaking on behalf of your proposal. This is important to remember, because what you're really trying to do in your proposal is to convince those assigned, particularly your primary reviewer, that your proposal is amazing. You're hoping that you can get this person to make a case for your proposal. Certainly they will still be talking about strengths and weaknesses, but you're really trying to convince that primary and secondary reviewers that this is the best proposal since sliced bread, so that they are actually advocating for your proposal during that study section review meeting. Now, I will say, I'm gonna move forward to look at our picture again. I think we had talked about this a little bit when we were focused on specific aims a couple months ago. But one thing to remember is that when your primary and secondary reviewers are talking and discussing your grant proposal, and it's only happening for 10 to 15 minutes, what happens for all the rest of the reviewers is your specific aims will pop up onto their computer screens. So you see they all are sitting there with their laptops open. As soon as your proposal comes up, your primary and secondary will start to make the case on whether they thought it was good or bad and why they scored it the way they did. They won't say it's bad because you were already in the top half. But you will have everybody else who will ultimately score your proposal looking at your specific aims page on their laptops. That's why it's so important to have a clear specific aims. That's why if you can come up with a conceptual diagram to include in your specific aims, it's really helpful for all of those other reviewers who just get kind of a flash of what your proposal is, and they're trying to listen to the primary and secondary talk about the strengths and weaknesses, and trying to make their own opinion about it as well before they all score your proposal. It's important to know that in the initial scores that the primary and secondary give to your proposal, they can revise their impact score upon conversation in the study section, but everybody else who is not assigned to your proposal, they will give your proposal an impact score, and it has to fall within the boundaries of what those assigned have given it. So if you have a primary who gave it a 2 and a secondary that gave it a 3, and a tertiary who gave it a 2, then everybody else in that group will have to give either a 2 or a 3. And if they want to go outside of that bracket, they have to give a justification for why they're voting or they're scoring outside of what the assigned reviewers have scored. Oops. Let me see here. So then based on all the scores submitted on your application, they are boiled down into one impact score, and I'll talk to you about sort of the math that goes into that in a second. Okay, so can I zoom out a little bit? Here is, oh, here we go. Let me zoom out just a little bit. Okay, so here is how the scores work for the NIH. So I already mentioned that the best scores are the lowest scores, which oftentimes seems kind of counterintuitive. Quick anecdote, I once worked with a PI who applied to the NIH for the first time, and they got their score back and hadn't heard about funding yet. And they had gotten a 2, and they were just beside themselves that they had failed when they got a 2 out of 9 on their proposal. And it wasn't until they met with their mentor that they realized that 2 was really good and they were going to get funded. So a little counterintuitive, but this is the scale that is used to grade all criteria at the NIH. And the reviewers are encouraged to use the full scale. So it's not like every proposal is going to be at the 1, 2, or 3 level. They want you to, if something is really just fair, they want you to give it a 7. So I mentioned already then, you choose your score as a reviewer, and then once all of the impact scores are entered during study section, they actually multiply it by 10, and then your final score will be in the range of 10 to 90, and the lower the better. And then the percentile is the percent of applications with a better score in the study section. So that will tell you how many proposals were actually scored better than your proposal. And the question that you're asking once you see those scores is, where is that pay line going to fall? Because it can fall in different places. And there are some study sections that tend to have lower scores, and that pay line ends up a lot higher up, and then there are some that tend to give really poor scores or high scores, and so then the pay line ends up differently. So having your score doesn't automatically tell you if you're funded or not, although it can give you a good idea. I'm going to pause there to see if there are questions coming up.
Yes, this is Crystal Lumpkins. I joined a little late, but on this pay line, could you explain more? I mean, I know what that is, but I'm assuming that there is, I guess, public knowledge out there about what the pay line is. How can you find that out, or is that something that's just evolved through the review process? I just want to know a little bit more about that.
Yes, so that's a great question. It's not automatic, so there's not any automatic pay line each time. And we'll talk about, I think to help answer this, we'll talk about the next piece of the process, because your proposal is not done after it's gone through study section and been scored. Setting the pay line kind of comes in the next step. So let me move on to that, and then we'll see if there's anything else. Oops, again, I'm kind of zoomed in. Let me back out a little. Okay. So once study section has done its work, as I mentioned before, a particular study section will be reviewing proposals that will go to different institutes. So you may have some going to NCI, or some going to NIA, or wherever they might go. NIDDK, whatever makes the most sense given the topic that they were focused on, they will go to different institutes if that's where they've been assigned. So once the institute gets all of the proposals from the different study sections in a particular round to review and decide on the level of funding, this is where your institute or your center staff will go through all of those applications, go through all of the scores. They do a little messing around with the math, because as I said, some study sections tend to have more low scores than other study sections. So they make an attempt to balance those scores when they come in so that it's fair to compare study sections. Given the history of scores and that sort of thing coming out of a particular study section. So the IC staff takes all of those proposals and all of the scores, and then they kind of order them, and they will decide based on their budgets where that pay line will fall. Now, I have to say here is where it gets a little non-technical, because if they put a pay line just based on where their budget is and how many they can fund, they may see some falling below that pay line that got worse scores than the pay line is at. And they may say, well, you know, one of our priorities for this session is exactly what this proposal is focused on, right below the pay line. And so they can make decisions to move it up, and that might actually push something else that might have been above the pay line had all things been equal, but that might push something below the pay line then. And this is why it's so important to align our proposals with the priorities of an institute and a particular program, because they will make those small micro adjustments with which get funded even after the review process. There's never going to be a time that an institute or center is going to be like, oh, this one was scored at the very worst, but it's right on target, we're going to move it up. They respect what the reviewers and the study section has said. They're not going to make drastic changes to the ordering of proposal scores. Well, they won't alter the scores at all, of course, but they will not grab something that was scored poorly and fund it because it's meeting a priority. But they might make those little adjustments to make sure that the portfolio of proposals, their funding, best meets their goals. So once the staff has come up with basically what they want to have funded in that session, then it will go in front of the board or the council for the institute or center that advises with the director of that institute or center, and then the director is making the final decision of what proposals are going to be funded in that particular round. So hopefully that helps answer the question of what that pay line means and how absolute it is, and when it moves maybe a little bit here and there. I'll make a note to do this. There was Sally Rocky, who was previously, she was the deputy director at the NIH for grant review, and she previously wrote a really nice blog explaining pay lines at the NIH. So I'll go look that up, or see her predecessor created one after that even better explains how that pay line is set and what that actually means. Are there any other questions? Okay. All right, let me back out of this one a little bit too. Okay, so based on that entire process, what you receive back from the NIH is this. You will get a summary statement that will include a summary of the discussion. This will be edited and written by the SRO. You will only get a summary of the discussion, of course, if your proposal was discussed. If your proposal is not discussed at study section, then you'll receive those initial scores on the criteria that those reviewers assigned your proposal gave it, along with any of their reviews and critiques of your proposal. But if it is discussed and not funded, you will get your critiques from the assigned reviewers. They will talk about the strengths and weaknesses for each of the criterion. And those criteria will include significance, approach, innovation, the investigator, and the environment. You'll get your overall impact score and the percentile score. And that again, the percentile score is the score overarching in the NIH that sort of evens out those study sections that tend to give lower scores or tend to give higher scores. They average it out across the entire NIH to give you a percentile score, so you know how you kind of stood up against proposals in that round overall. And then budget recommendations. If it's not discussed, like I said, you'll get your critiques and scores for each criteria from those reviewers assigned to it. And then on this last bullet point, oftentimes if you're not discussed, the SRO will not edit those comments from the reviewers. You'll be getting comments straight from the reviewers that were assigned your proposal themselves. So I want to back up a little bit because I think we have talked about some things and we have not covered other things. I think I will begin just talking a little bit about following up when you have you've found out that you will not be funded and you have your scores and your summary statement. Now, you basically have a couple of decisions to make once you get your reviews back and you're not funded. Firstly, I like to tell PIs that you shouldn't make any of these decisions quickly. You should take your reviews, look at them, probably get a little mad about them, and put them away and give it a week before, let yourself cool off a little bit, because you put in a lot of work to get these proposals together, and when they're not funded, I don't care who you are, it's disappointing. So give yourself a little time, put them away, and then after a week or so, when you're ready, take them back out and read through all of the feedback that you got. I also recommend that you meet with mentors or colleagues to get their thoughts on what you're seeing. If you're lucky, somewhat lucky, the summary statement will make sense. You'll know what they're asking you to do in terms of resubmission. But if you're not so lucky, and I think this is pretty common, you'll have questions about that summary statement. You won't fully understand what's being, let's see, I think I have a, oops, I lost my chat box. You'll have questions about what it means. Some of the comments might seem conflicting and you're not sure what exactly they want you to do. But before you go back to anybody at the NIH to ask questions about it, find a mentor, find a colleague, go through the comments, the summary statement with them to get their take on it, to see what they're seeing. So you're trying to decide whether you want to resubmit this proposal as an A1. So the first time you submit a proposal, it's considered an A0. That's your initial submission. When you resubmit to the NIH, you can choose for it to be an A1, and that is resubmission of the proposal, and you get to include a response statement where you highlight what changes you've made specifically to your proposal, and then the study section, it will go back to the same study section, and they will be able to see your responses, and you can highlight the changes you've made in the proposal to go along with your response statement. If you were not discussed or they really didn't like it for whatever reason, you may decide to just submit it as a brand new proposal. And in that case, they won't get a response statement, but sometimes if you're gonna do a whole lot of rework, it's worth it to just submit it as a brand new proposal. Now, I will say the folks in the study section tend to be, there's some turnover, but they are the same group for quite a while. So they likely will recognize your proposal and remember it from before, but if you're doing an overhaul of the proposal, you probably want to submit it as an A0 as a brand new submission. The third choice is you may look at what they said and how it was reviewed and say, you know, I don't think this is a great fit for me. I think I'm going to go to a different institute, a different study section, or even a different agency with this project. So those are sort of the decisions you're making. And as you make those decisions and you're talking to your mentor and colleagues, once you're ready, I highly encourage you to reach out to the program officer at the institute and ask to have a discussion with them about what you're thinking in terms of making revisions to your proposal. You want to get their take on whether, you know, they can even help you make the decision on whether it's an A0 or an A1, or if they think you should go somewhere else. I had a PI tell a story recently where they were not funded, but they had gotten a pretty good score. And so he went to the program officer and said, you know, I think I'm going to take this somewhere else. And the program officer was like, no, don't take it anywhere else, like, and gave them ideas and put them in contact with other people, because that program officer wanted to keep that person in their broader portfolio. They wanted them to resubmit. But that was telling when the PI was like, I think I should go somewhere else. And they said, no, we want you here. Let's work with you to get you where you need to be to get funded. So talking with the program officer and getting their feedback, helping you read between the lines of some of the reviews, they can oftentimes help with that too. So in addition to working with program officers as you're developing the proposal initially, I also encourage you to reach out to them when you get your reviews to talk about what makes sense in terms of resubmissions. So that's a little bit about working with POs, particularly related to resubmissions. We talked a little bit about choosing review panels, choosing study sections, and how to do that. So I think the last question is to look at the NCI and how to sort of pitch your grant related to disparities and Native communities. Now, as with anything, so I should first say a grant proposal is supposed to be pitching to reviewers. So it is different, as you know, than an academic article. The whole thing is supposed to be oriented to making a case for funding, for investing in your research by, in this instance, the National Institutes of Health. So a couple of things generally that you can do to pitch your research are to first and foremost be as responsive to a program announcement as you can be. So hopefully areas you're submitting to actually have language where they're asking or they're looking for something related to disparities or Native communities. If not, it doesn't mean that's wrong for you, but you have to then make the case of why this meets what they're asking for. So you read through the program announcement, and they maybe don't say we're looking to remedy health disparities, but maybe there's other language that you can pitch to say, by my doing my research and focusing on these Native communities or on these types of health disparities, I am helping you reach this goal, meeting this objective. And use the very language that they use in the program announcement. So I like to say it's the difference between using jargon and buzzwords. You want to use as little jargon, that technical terminology, as possible in grant proposals, because it just is real easy to lose people who aren't very far from your field when reviewing something. But the buzzwords are the language that the agency in the program announcement is actually using to say what they want. So you have to then use that language and say, here, I'm giving you exactly what you want, and this is the best way to do it, and here's why. So using their own language to pitch what you're doing and show them how it is meeting their goals is very important for everyone to do. But particularly if you feel like your area is sometimes ignored or not considered as much as you think it would be, you then have to make the case for why it's so crucial to meet the agency's goals. So I'll say that in terms of pitching, things that you think need a little additional selling to a particular study section and institute. So let me pause there and see if there are other questions or other ideas in response to any of these topics that y'all want to share. As we're waiting, I think there's also, as we've seen at the NIH in the last 5 or so years, they have made movement, however small or large, toward issues of equity, particularly related to research and the requirements of both sexes, all sexes included in research. You have to make justification if you're only looking at male mice, for example. And they have also noted and started to acknowledge the past marginalization of people of color. Certainly, we are seeing health disparities in a new light given COVID and what we're seeing as a result of that. So I think that there's a moment right now that the NIH has been, in my opinion, slow to move toward, but they are moving. And we have a moment now where I think making those pitches becomes a little easier to do, or you at least have the NIH and other folks, other leadership starting to say, we have to find ways of addressing these sorts of disparities because they're not, of course, going away. I do know that the NIH has focused more on pipeline and getting researchers, more researchers of color, more women, more young researchers into their funding pipeline. And that's why, if you're a new investigator, absolutely make sure that you are using that new investigator status. Be careful that you don't lose your new investigator status by being a co-PI on another major grant. Make sure you know exactly what you need to do to keep your new investigator status as long as you can. Because one thing I didn't mention is during study section, they will group proposals by status. So they will look at new investigators all together. So even though you are still being scored amidst a larger group, they will look at new investigators and have those discussions separately with the hopes that the reviewers will recognize that they are looking at early career investigators in that particular portion. All right.
Although,
yes.
sorry. Hi,
please.
Hi, Naomi. This is Natabona Mabachi, and I'm so glad you brought up this. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I'm so glad that you brought up this topic. I realized that, so the NIH has been working on this issue of funding disparities. The NIH seems to have really improved in regards to care awards, which, sort of sinks in with what you're saying about new and early investigators. But they show that there's still disparities in terms of other funding mechanisms. And I don't know if you know what they're doing to address that, because there's some of us who aren't new investigators are moving into mid-career, but the disparities still continue to exist.
Yeah. I don't know at the institute level what each is doing in terms of strategizing. I do imagine, though, that there is pressure on all of them. I know, especially with the pipeline issues, they face more and more fire for not having an equitable funding portfolio across the entire NIH. And as you mentioned, some institutes do better than others, and some mechanisms do better than others. But I would imagine that they are facing fire on it. And yeah, I think my only advice is to talk with colleagues and mentors, and maybe even look for folks at a particular institute. Maybe that's even a conversation you have with a program officer, particularly as a mid-career person, reaching out to a program officer and saying, having a candid conversation about what you want to be doing and where you are seeing barriers, and asking those questions. What is the institute doing to remedy these disparities across their funding? We have some stuff in the chat that I want to pay attention to. Let's see here. Oh, let me see. Sorry. To scroll. Okay, so Chesley, thank you for that comment. How do we know if we've compromised early career status in my new job as assistant professor. I've been placed as a co-I on an R25, but was told it wouldn't impact my status. Is this correct? I think that is correct. It's my answer for everything, but I would always, in making decisions like those, I would check in with a program officer to make sure that it doesn't hurt your status. Also, there's a difference, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a difference at the NIH between a new investigator and an early career investigator, and it matters differently in different scenarios. But I would always check with a program officer as you make decisions to be co-Is on things to make sure it doesn't hurt your status. And that's it's an easy question for them to answer. But in addition to that, you want to, and we'll talk more about this during the K seminar, but you also want to understand the spirit for which a program was intended. If you're not a good fit, when it comes to eligibility issues, if you're not a good fit for something, but you're technically eligible, that's not something you want to spend time going after, because they are looking for a perfect fit for what they're trying to do. So just more generally, I encourage you to always have a conversation with a program officer to see if these moves are the right thing. I think being a co-I on an R25 is probably fine, especially if your mentor said that it was, or your colleague did, but I would always check with the PO to make sure that that is the case. All right, let me move on.
Thank you.
Sure. Just in case people aren't aware of the NIH RADx programs, one initiative is RADx Underserved Populations, RADx Up. The overarching goal of the RADx Up initiative is to understand the factors associated with disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality, and to lay the foundation to reduce disparities for those underserved and vulnerable populations who are disproportionately affected. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll. By have the highest infection rates of and or are most at risk for complications or poor outcomes from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the budget is $500 million, and there is a link there. So that, I was not familiar with that one. So thank you, Becca, for sharing that. And then here's a link to stats definitions. Thank you, Becca, for that. Are there any other questions or comments or resources? Okay, well, I have as my homework that I'm gonna look up that Sally Rocky blog to find, and I will send that to Dr. Cano to send out to all of you. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you at the September 9th seminar on NIHK awards. Well, we'll dig a little more into what that K proposal looks like and how to put it together and be competitive for a K, and the different types of Ks, because there's a lot of them. And I will stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Nishi.
You're welcome.
This was really informative and great. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions before the 9th or want to sign up, just send me an email and we'll make sure to put you on the list and be ready.
Thank you all.
Thank you.